welcome to one of our short videos, our Take 5 Minutes for Health and Safety. And in this particular short video, we're going to talk about dynamic risk assessments. So you've all done your risk assessments as required by the Management of Health and Safety Work Regs, looking at traditional health and safety hazards and risks. So what's a dynamic risk assessment? So it's where we are responding to a changing situation. So this particular approach is a continuous assessment of the hazard and risk and making instant changes. So it's not writing them all down, it's right, we're here, what do we need to do? So this particular approach was initially developed by the emergency services, the fire service, because every fire that they go to, every single event that they go to is different, and you need people trained to take in that information, make some instant judgments, implement some control measures that minimize the risk. So most of you are not going to be dealing with fires, but we have taken some of those principles and use them in the wider context of health and safety. So if you've got jobs like maintenance or one-off non-routine jobs, or you've got where people go out into the other work areas or out into the middle of nowhere, you've got to rely on people there to make judgments and decide what needs to be done. So that is where your dynamic risk assessment comes in. It's not a substitute for your ordinary general risk assessment. It's adding to it with that local bit of information. So we're here, we've got to assess the situation, taking into account us and the other things around us. What do we need to do? Are there any changes? Are there any different measures that we need to implement right here and now that minimize the risk to me and minimize the risk to other people? If you use dynamic risk assessment, you've got to train your staff in the skills, not just risk assessment, but the skills they need to make those decisions. It allows them to instantaneously spot additional hazards and risks, consider the existing control measures that we've got, but identify any additional control measures that are needed. And in a way, you do this every time you cross the road. You look at the road, you look at the traffic, you look at the weather, you then decide, right, is it safe for me to proceed? And if you're just about to step out and then you see a car, you're going to pull back. You're making an instant decision. So dynamic risk assessment is taking those principles, things that we do all of the time. So it's for unique changing situations. We assess it, evaluate it right there and then. We weigh up what different options that we are. We then take those particular options, we weigh them up, pros and cons. We make a decision. If we do this, is it going to bring the situation under control? So when we're making decisions, and we do this all the time, not just in dynamic risk assessments, but we are weighing the risks with the benefits. So if you are waiting to cross the road, are you in a hurry? And sometimes if you're in a hurry, you might take more risks than if you're not. So when a dynamic risk assessment is being done, we're looking at what are the risks, what are the benefits, and equally, what are the costs? If I make the decision, is it going to help reduce the risk? Or if I rush it and do this, is it actually going to put my life and the life of other people at risk as well? Dynamic risk assessment, far more focus on the individual. You've got to train individuals, give them better levels of skills and knowledge so that they can make those decisions to protect themselves and other people. Dynamic risk assessments are definitely not written down as you do them. You may make some notes after the situation. They don't replace your general risk assessment, but they're the on-the-spot bit, right there. I'm in the middle of nowhere. I'm carrying out this task. Is it safe to proceed? Yes or no? A prosecution, just very briefly to show you, could a dynamic risk assessment have prevented this accident? We had a festival that was being set up. A lorry loader operator was seriously injured when he was delivering the cabin that you can see in the picture here to the site of a music festival. It was going to be the security cabin. He unloaded that cabin and it was underneath a 11,000 volt overhead cable. And unfortunately, the crane touched the line and the operator received a severe electric shock and a burn. The line height was about 7 meters. In terms of a dynamic risk assessment, you could have all the other policies and procedures in place, but here we had multiple people with responsibilities. You had the festival organisers who should have identified that the line was there. Equally, the crane operator should have done that dynamic risk assessment. He should have had a look around before he started moving and unloading the cabin. We had the festival organisers. They had engaged an event planning company whose remit was to do the risk assessments, but they didn't do full risk assessments, and their remit wasn't to look at everything. It was more to look at the event once it was up and running. So a dynamic risk assessment, whether it was by the festival organiser, the supervisor right there and then, and or the crane operator, if they got out, just had a look around, looking at what the hazards and risks were, they could have made appropriate decisions, i.e. do not unload that cabin under the cable. Nowhere was the hazards and risks of the cable identified. And the judge agreed. So this had led to a prosecution of the festival organisers, and the judge basically said it was common sense. The live line should not have been where they were unloading this cabinet. And if just any one of those three parties had recognised that, the accident would have been prevented. And this is a simple site risk assessment, a dynamic risk assessment right there and then would have identified, here is an overhead cable, we are unloading this cabin. If we unload it under that cable, there is a significant risk of an electric shock. Let's move the cabin elsewhere. We can't move the cable. And the lack of dynamic risk assessment, the lack of risk assessment and health and safety led to the event organisers pleading guilty to a charge under the Health and Safety at Work Act. They were fined £20,000 with 25k costs. A dynamic risk assessment would have saved the prosecution, saved the costs, and equally saved the operator from getting a severe injury. A potted tour about dynamic risk assessments. This is Jackie Cambridge from Cambridge Safety. Thank you very much for watching. If you've got high risk, non-routine activities, maybe maintenance and things like that, this is where just that dynamic risk assessment can help you meet your obligations, but also ensure your staff are safe.